Did you know that 60% of Africa's population is under 25? Yet, most global AI and open source conversations happen without Africa at the table. That is changing. Imagine the potential of young Africa's developers, startups, and communities fully connected to global open source and AI initiatives. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting session on the future of open source and AI in Africa. My name is Didas Shimana. I'm a full-stack software engineer and open source advocate. Actually, I'm in Kigali. It's 5 p.m. And we are honored to have with us Amanda Brock, CEO of OpenUK and a global leader in open source policy, innovation, and community building. Today, Amanda will share with us insights, strategies, and inspiring lessons on how open source and AI are shaping Africa's tech ecosystem and what opportunities exist for developers, startups, and communities like us. Amanda, it's absolutely a pleasure to have you today. Before we dive in, I just want to remind our audience this session is live and you can share your questions in the chat at any time you want. Over to you, Amanda, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Didas, for having me along today. Let's just see if we can get these slides to present. There we go. No, we don't. Got you into the slides. Let's go back. That's it. There we go. So good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. And thank you very much for having me along today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my background, what I do with OpenUK, and talk to you a bit about open source generally. Then look at AI in the context of open source and talk to you a little bit about where I see the future going. So to start with, I began my career in open source almost 18 years ago when I joined a company called Canonical. You'll probably know Ubuntu, the operating system, and Canonical is the commercial sponsor of Ubuntu. And I joined Canonical supposedly for 3 months, but ended up staying 5 years. After I left Canonical, I continued to work in open source, did a couple of other jobs as well. But for that 18-year period, I've continuously been part of the open source community, contributing particularly to governance and policy projects. I'm probably best known in certain parts of open source as the editor of this book, Open Source Law, Policy and Practice. It was put together with 26 different experts. Not trying to sell you the book, but if you follow this QR code, you will get the open access English version of the book. And when the book went live 4 years ago, nearly now, we did a panel at All Things Open in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that panel went viral on the internet in China, which led to some of the Chinese community pulling together a Mandarin translation of the book, which was launched in December at COSCON in Beijing. And I get to spend a lot of my life these days talking about open source. OpenUK, the organization that I lead, was the first organization set up to be a combination of a community organization and policy organization. So I get involved in global conversations about open source. And to tell you a little bit about OpenUK, we are an industry body with the purpose of UK leadership and global collaboration in open technology. We started for the first 6 months just with UK leadership, and then we realized that everything we do is global. Everything we do is part of that globally collaborative open source community. And we use the term open technology, not open source. You may or may not be familiar with that. We use it because we realized when we set OpenUK up in 2020 that you have to think about software in the context of hardware and data today. And that's become more and more true as we've seen AI evolve. So we used to talk about 3 pillars of open technology: software, hardware, data. It's not always apparent to everybody that those include standards and AI, although they do. So we added software, hardware, data, standards, and AI to that definition. And in using that, we believe we cover everything that would be open. And we work on 3 pillars. We build community. We bring together the UK's open source community. This is us in November at our 6th annual awards ceremony, which is part of our recognition program, along with our honours list. We've recognized over 500 people in 6 years on the honours list, and we've, I think, given out something like 50 awards in that time. We then take that community, we convene the community, and we give them a cohesive voice. And that voice has an influence in law and policy. We realize that to really demonstrate to policymakers what open source is and how it is in the UK, that we needed to start doing research and reporting. And we've now done that for going into our 5th year. You can see our reports if you follow these QR codes through to the website. And then the third pillar is about learning. And we've had kids competitions and camps. We've done training in future founders, future leaders. There's all sorts of freely available content on our website. And just to give you a sort of snapshot of just over a year ago, here's some of our metrics. You can get a sense of the number of people who are in our meetup groups, who come along to events, number of events we have. And we do an annual conference, which for the first 3 years has been a single large event in London, and it will be that again in 2027. But we decided to do something slightly different this year, and we're taking it on the road with 5 events. We should be able to release the dates of those 5 events before the end of January. And that's partly because we realize that big events are not getting the same response they used to. We know that people don't have travel budgets right now, so we thought we'd go out to the community and bring them together. OpenUK, by its nature, is UK focused. And this summer, we launched a sister organization. We did a very soft launch of that, OpenHQ. And OpenHQ is about supporting local communities in different countries as they bring together their policy work. And we started with India. We started with India because they have an AI summit they're hosting in February. That AI summit is something that follows on from Bletchley Park. Many of you will have seen the Global Leaders AI Summit at Bletchley Park in, was it 2022, 4 years ago? Since then, it's been held in South Korea. It was held in Paris in February last year, which I was able to attend. I was invited by the French government. There were 500 people. And I was the first person from leadership in open source communities who was invited along to a summit. And I think that's important and something that we really want to expand on. And if you go back to our reports, you'll see in those reports that we did one on the summit. I've been invited to the main summit, the Global Leaders Summit in India. There'll be a much broader, more structured organization around the fringe in India. So OpenUK will also be hosting a couple of panel sessions, one in the main summit, and we will have a workshop in the main summit, as well as me giving a keynote and attending the smaller Global Leaders event. And what we've tried to do over the last 6 months with this project with OpenHQ is bring together the open source community in India. And I have to say, I feel we've achieved it. We reached out to as many policy organizations and open source community organizations as we could, because if we can't get open source on the agenda properly in Delhi, we're not going to get it on the agenda anywhere. Prime Minister Modi of India co-hosted the last summit with the French Prime Minister and French President Macron. And he opened the summit by talking about openness and access for all. It's very, very clear that, that's through open source. So it's important that we have this open source community presence in India. And I think that's really coming together quite well. Now, when we look at the UK has the world's first open source policy in the public sector. So we have the first open source first policy that came from the Cabinet Office in 2011. So it's nearly 17 years old now. And I was part of the advisory board that helped put that together. As we have looked into open source in the UK and tried to explore it more, what we've seen is that the traditional way we measure open source is GitHub accounts. Now, that's not going to really show you exactly what the number of open source contributors are, but it's the metric that's used across the planet to do so. And in the UK, we see 4.8 million. Now, that puts us 5th in the world. It's a fraction of what you'll see in India or China. However, when we look at the per capita, that is 7.1%, and that's higher than any other country in the world. And we see the different metrics that you can build on the back of this when we start to look at number of contributors, number of commits accepted. When we start to get into that detail, we see the UK really is a leader despite being a small country. We're by far number 1 in Europe and generally 5th in the world when it comes to open source. Now, we don't have the same available data today for Africa. And with the work we're doing with OpenHQ, it's something that I hope we can start to drill down into, perhaps collaborating with some of the communities on the ground in Africa. And Didas and I were talking before this session today. I'm going to be in Kigali the week of 9th March, and I hope that maybe we can have some conversations then. What we're going to do within OpenUK is our next annual survey, and that survey, the responses to it are used to work out a lot of the data that we can then crunch and create metrics from. So in terms of looking at community engagement, contribution, value of open source to your country, that comes from that survey response. And what we're going to do for the first time in 2026 is we're going to open our survey up to be a global survey. Historically, it's been UK only. And if anybody had answered it from somewhere else in the world, that would have disqualified them from being part of the survey. This time, we're going to encourage as many people as we can across the globe to participate. And that will help us to start to build out data under the OpenHQ brand to help local communities demonstrate the importance of open source as they begin to do policy work and begin to engage with lawmakers, policymakers in their own country. I'm coming to Africa in March with Mojaloop. I'm on the board of Mojaloop, and Mojaloop is an open source foundation that has come out of the Gates Foundation. It's a payment platform. And I think what it does is it really shows in a beautiful way the value that open source brings to the global south. And by giving a payment platform or bringing a payment platform into a country and helping to build it out, because it's open source, it creates a significant difference where it's not just about giving a tool and then charging for it. What it's about is bringing communities in and helping communities understand how you build sustainable software infrastructure in the long term. And I think it's a really good example of the kind of thing that can be achieved through open source. And I'm hoping that as it goes into different countries, what we'll see is communities learning how to build that infrastructure for the greater good, but also for their individual good, learning skills and building careers. Because what we really see in the UK, and I think in Africa, we will see it increasingly, is that so long as you have access to connectivity and you build the skills through open source, you are then able to engage in an environment where you can work anywhere. You can work from Africa in the same ways we do from the UK for companies in the US, in China. And obviously there's a slight time difference issue that we all have to accommodate by doing that. But you have one of the advantages that we have in the UK, which is English language. And that means that the UK is currently one of the first countries that the big techs come to, the international companies come to employ people. And there is less of a boundary of your location than there ever has been. So I think we will see projects like Mojaloop enabling people to build skills, and those skills then enabling people to get international jobs, which has a knock-on effect. It's not just building in personal skills, it's building an ecosystem and then in turn building funding coming into your home country as you earn from those international companies. So there's a huge number of different advantages and benefits around open source as opposed to closed or proprietary environments for Africa as we see this emerge. And I think at this point it's worth just pausing, and I do this in almost every conversation I have about anything, and look at what open source actually is and why that matters. And it often gets forgotten. So if we start with the basics and we look at what open source is software where the human readable source code, the piece that has historically been kept secret because it is the intellectual property that allows you to generate revenue. That source code is shared. And what that is practically is if you speak the language, you are then able to do things with that code. So what that does is allow you to contribute new changes to the code to modify, etc. So the source itself has to be open, and then the license, because software has copyright, the source code that's shared has to be shared in a license, and the license has to meet the open source definition. And that open source definition is safeguarded by the Open Source Initiative, and it has 10 definitions. Now, in all honesty, almost nobody can tell you what these 10 definitions are. It's important that you get a license that meets them. The simple way to do that is to get one that's approved by the OSI, because you have the default of knowing it is. But fundamentally, for me, what it means is 5 and 6, that there is no discrimination amongst people and no discrimination against fields of endeavor. And in short, that means anyone can use the code for any purpose. Now, that's according to the license. Law trumps licensing. So if there's a local law that you have to comply with, say, for example, you're not allowed to murder someone, then you cannot use the code to do that. So law trumps licensing, but the license says anyone can use it for any purpose. And sometimes there's confusion around that, even amongst people that you would think should know better. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So open source, of course, is much more than that. It's about community, it's about contribution. And if you want your open source, if you're open sourcing your own code to be successful, you have to do more. Simply releasing it will not be enough to bring people to it. If you build it, they will not come. They will only come if you engage, you build community, and you take contribution. And when I joined Canonical 18 years ago, it was pretty tough, right? We were blocked in having code adopted by the enterprise, by community gatekeepers like, or enterprise gatekeepers like lawyers, accountants, procurement professionals. And we've seen this massive shift. That shift has come about for a number of reasons, primarily because we now live in a digital world. And in the last 10 years, digitalization has normalized the platform economy and the cloud economy. And that platform and cloud environment is almost entirely built on open source software. We've seen Git really evolve, and the likes of GitHub and GitLab allow collaborative working, and that's shifted things so that the gatekeeper is bypassed. And the gatekeeper is bypassed because engineers can go to GitHub and bring code into their company without having to go through a process of approval. And that's really thanks to the licenses being standard. And what we see is enterprise adoption has gone through the roof to a point in time where, when we look at a software stack, a commercial stack, over 70% of that software is open source, but over 90% of the software running in a commercial stack today has dependencies or requires open source to run. So in the enterprise, I think the best story to demonstrate that shift is the Microsoft one. And it's Microsoft have been on a journey that every company's been on. And that journey towards open source for Microsoft is perhaps more obvious than most, because in the early days, Microsoft's CEO, Steve Ballmer, described open source as a cancer. But 10 years later, by the time you get to 2018, we see Steve Wally here, a friend of mine from the open source office at Microsoft, giving a keynote in Edinburgh with Satya Nadella behind him, asking to be judged by the actions of today and the future, not the actions of the past. And Steve explains Microsoft's journey is based on 3 things. For the last 20 years, engineers have been taught to code using open source. So that the methodology is what they're used to. And if you want to hire the best engineers, you need to hire engineers. You need to allow those engineers to use open source. Secondly, if you want to run a cloud environment, public cloud is almost entirely built on it. So for Azure, Microsoft has had to really engage with open source. And then thirdly, they started to see their clients specifically asking for open source packages by name. Now, it's not just the enterprise. We also see the public sector shifting at pace to open source. And the public sector historically has wanted to use open source for 2 reasons: to avoid vendor lock-in and to enable code to be built that was recycled and reused. In the last year, geopolitical shift has really come up the agenda. It's something we've been talking about in the UK for the last 5 years because of Brexit. But it's really come to the fore, and questions of sovereignty, whatever sovereignty might mean, have been discussed in every country in the world. And really, I think what we're talking about isn't so much that something is made locally, which would be the opposite of open source, but what we're talking about is that we remove dependency and enable trust. And I think we should see open source really come to the fore, because if you create trust and access through transparency, through the openness, then actively you are removing the concerns that have caused the basis of sovereignty discussions. And I think it's super interesting, and we'll come back to this in the AI section, that as part of that geopolitical shift, we've seen the US also moving more and more towards wanting open source because they understand the influence that the open source companies have. So when we talk about things like AI and we see DeepSeek's impact, the US has reacted to that by wanting more open source. So sticking with software for now, there have been a number of challenges. I've mentioned the level of adoption, the 90+% dependencies in all software in the stack, and 70+%, it's around 76, on actually being open source. So it looks like we've won, but there's so much confusion and so many myths about open source. And the reason we see this is that the pace of adoption has not been matched by a pace of understanding. And this is a little image that we use within OpenUK in some of our reporting. And we see that there is this confusion between open and closed and open and proprietary. And people often think that everything that is open source. But if we go back to that definition, remember, anyone can use it for any purpose. So if you add a commercial restriction to it, what you find is that that is no longer open source, but it's proprietary because you are restricting who can use it or how they use it, even although the code is ostensibly open. And in reality today, we're looking at three kinds of software: open source, closed proprietary, and something in between. Technically, it's proprietary, but we get into all sorts of fights and arguments if we start to call it proprietary, because folk who like to open their code don't like it to be called proprietary, even although it is. So what we have is this third category that's emerged of public or distributed source. And the trouble with it is that when you have open source, anyone can use the code for any purpose, which allows a free flow, which is at the heart of the adoption. There's a trust thing there where I can take the code, I can use it, I can pass it to you with certainty that you can use it for that purpose or any purpose. When we start to put conditions in, we have to go back and review licenses, and it sort of breaks that free flow that is so important to open source's success. We see that not only unintentional confusion, but sometimes intentional. And in 21, we really started to see fights in the open source community as we talked about this third category. And this is, for this particular slide, is a headline from Elastic, who moved Elasticsearch away from an open source license to a license with restrictions, but had a headline that was doubling down on open. And that sort of slightly disingenuous way of describing it has become known as open washing. And open washing is when you call something open source that does not meet the standard. And the standard is pretty hard, right? If you distribute something that anyone can use for any purpose without restriction, and you do it commercially, what you're actually doing is saying that I'm enabling you, my competitor, with my innovation. You can use it for free. So I think it's important to understand that open source is not a business model. Proprietary software is, because it comes with the ability to charge a royalty. Open source wasn't designed to have a business model. Any business model has to be an add-on to the open source licensing regime. So we get this concern with open washing. And I think it's also accentuated by the fact that we kind of have three generations of open source. We have the Gen 1, I call them the Linux generation, but that generation of people who came into open source as a socio-political movement. It's not so much about their age or even when they come into open source, although the early stages, you'd see more of this. And then we have a second generation, and that generation came to open source more because it was the best available code or tools, and they got involved, and then probably later found out that it was open source and what open source really means. And it's not an age thing. I've got a board director who's a year younger than me, who's Gen 2, while I'm Gen 1. You know, I believe in the values of it. She came into it because she was using Kubernetes and then gradually got into open source. She'll describe herself as somebody who is a sort of late adopter. And now we see evolving Gen 3, AI in the future. And part of the challenge is, if you were not Gen 1, and you didn't come into it because of the social political thing, and you didn't understand the nuances and the whys, it's quite likely that you won't know a lot of the detail of open source and its licensing, even although you're working in it. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. And today, that scale of adoption and success means that we have this apocryphal two guys in Nebraska sitting under the internet with open source holding up our digital infrastructure. And that creates challenges. It creates challenges where we live in a world of concerns about sovereignty. Governments are more concerned than they've ever been about the security of the software. And we live in a digital world which enhances that and those concerns. So we see challenges around making sure open source is secure. Now, if you think about it, open source and proprietary software, both, all software, have the challenges of security. It's not something that's specific to open source. The challenges are different, and in open source, we wash our dirty linen in public, which means that we see anything that goes wrong being something that everybody's aware of. There's no hiding it in a black box, which is probably a good thing and enables a community response, but it just means that people are more aware of open source vulnerabilities. We also have this challenge about maintainers. So open source, as I said, wasn't designed to have a business model, which means that we have software which is taken and used in commercial organizations without an obligation for them to give back. They don't have to take a service contract or anything else to use it. When we get to the stage of getting these service contracts in place, that's when the gatekeepers do come in, even today. And we have this whole ecosystem challenge where individuals who may have created something in their free time then have that something as something they have to support. That package is something they have to support or feel they have to support. And many of the engineers, because in their professional lives they meet SLAs, feel that they have to do that and meet challenges. So we know that the ecosystem is under pressure. We know that people don't necessarily give back the way they should. Corporates don't necessarily give back the way they should. And we really need to think about how we shift and change that if open source is going to have the future it needs. In Europe, we've seen a lot of talk, a lot of pushing for a fund. There's currently a consultation going on in the EU around this. NLnet in the Netherlands has for many years, for decades now, managed funding for open source. And in the last few years, we've seen the German Sovereign Tech Agency do something similar. But the funding they have is tiny. It is tens of millions, but it's a drop in the ocean in the big picture. And in the UK, we've been working with the public sector, trying to persuade them to build sustainable software infrastructure through open source and committing into the ecosystem. And the kind of levels that we've been talking to them about are about 20% of the innovation funding they have today, which is billions of dollars, billions of pounds. Because if you really want to fund an ecosystem at scale, that's the kind of level of funding we're going to need. Now, open source has really hit the headlines in the last couple of years because of AI openness. I'm going to try not to use the term open source AI because it's quite disputed. We have a bit of a challenge because AI really started to take off in the public view in March 2023, almost 3 years ago, when ChatGPT 4 came out. And as it did, we started to have these conversations about AI openness. And the challenge we had is that ChatGPT 4 was and is created by OpenAI. And OpenAI is the logical thing to call AI that is open. And many of you will know that OpenAI was originally set up as a foundation. It was supposed to be a not-for-profit that was open source and then shifted away from that. So because it has a trademark on this OpenAI term, that causes lots of confusion. And open source AI as a term is used very badly, and it's used across the board for things that don't meet a standard of open source, which is a huge problem for all of us. But March 2023, we start to see an acceleration in open source and AI, and in AI generally. We see Llama, which was licensed purely for research purposes on an open basis, leaked. So the LLM is leaked, and we see a massive innovation curve. It goes through the roof between March and May 2023 as we have the open source community being given access to an LLM, a large language model, for the first time. And by May 2023, this memo was leaked from Google. It is the opinion of one individual, not necessarily the company, but it talks about having no moat. And what it's talking about is that the big techs who'd invested hundreds of millions of dollars at that stage in building LLMs couldn't rely on the IP in those LLMs as a moat, as a protection from open source. And what that meant practically was that the open source innovation that was freely available was as good as what the companies had to sell. And they weren't sure how they were going to be able to sell versus the open source community's projects being taken and publicly used. So by July of 23, we see Meta starting, or June, July, we see Meta starting to talk about formally opening up Llama on a proper open source license. And in July, OpenUK partnered with Meta. Now, that partnership for us was really important. We were the only open source or open tech organization that did this. And we have a broad remit within OpenUK. And we made a decision, and I say we because my whole board were unanimous that we should support this, in supporting Meta opening Llama, although it was not open source. And this is the website screenshot from that time. And what we committed to was supporting an open innovation approach to AI. And this is what Llama was calling this is what Meta rather was calling Llama until the point of launch, open innovation. And at the point of launch, Martin Zuckerberg posted and called it open source. And that's where the debates all began. So shortly afterwards, because I've been part of this whole process, I was able to talk quite openly about why Llama is not open source, but it's okay. It's a good thing because it's moving us forward. It's giving access to that innovation in an open way that we just didn't have. And it wasn't as far as we'd like to go, but it was a good next step. And these problems of the use of open source as a term really started to be problematic, and people couldn't work out whether things were open or not. The Llama license has a restriction in it on commercialization, and it also has an acceptable use policy. And those things stop it meeting the traditional open source definition. It got as far as the New York Times having a front cover and The Economist talking about open washing and the battle around open source AI. The Open Source Initiative created a second definition on open source AI. It's embryonic, although it was published about a year ago. It's got a long way to go and it hasn't been very well adopted. I think there's only like 20 companies signed up to it. So it really hasn't filled the gap. And what we've ended up with is moving towards a more disaggregated approach, looking at the different components which are in AI and whether or not those have the open source licenses we would traditionally have for the software elements, and whether they meet that standard. And with DeepSeek, what we saw a year ago exactly was a LLM being launched where it was an open weight or an open model. And this terminology is what's become normalized as part of the disaggregation. So rather than talking about an open source LLM, we talk about an open model or an open weight, which would have a traditional open source software license. In the case of DeepSeek R1, which was launched a year ago, we also see great data explaining, great documentation explaining how to use it. So although the data that went with it was closed, the model itself for the weights were open, that allowed, the documentation allowed Hugging Face to build R1 open within days, and we saw a properly open LLM with open data. DeepSeek do not share the data. And the data today is probably the biggest challenge. Now, one of the things that's super important about DeepSeek's R1 is that it reduced the cost of an LLM using new distillation technology from 100 million to 5 million. And that's a massive difference. And that suddenly makes these things more accessible to emerging markets and the global south. That reduction in cost is critical. And what it also does is it shows you that somebody in China could take technology that had been opened by Chinese companies and American companies. It built on Llama and it iterated. It's that iterative development from open source software that's been at the heart of its success, taking and building and iterating new innovation. And that's exactly what DeepSeek did with this open weight model. And it's the opportunity that we'll see in Africa. It's the opportunity to take existing technology, that's existing innovation that's been opened up, and to build on top of it, to come up with your own fantastic ideas. And we've seen historically how hard it is for big incumbent technology companies to truly innovate on the cutting edge of innovation. And there is a bit of an expectation that something will come from left field in the way DeepSeek did, from somewhere unexpected, potentially from somewhere like Africa. Now, the impact that DeepSeek had, I loved it because Sam Altman was quoted on Reddit as saying that he thought OpenAI was on the wrong side of history when it came to openness in January last year. And by the summer, we see the US's AI action plan saying that they are going to encourage open weights and open models. Now, open source weights and open models. We don't know how they're going to do that. Within weeks, however, we see OpenAI releasing its first open large language model. And that really is something that is going to be impactful. In China in October, I think we saw the next really big significant piece in this picture. And China operates its digital economy on 5-year plans. Its last one just came to an end in 2025. And in October, it released its plan for 2026 to 2030. Now, in 2017, China was public about having an open source first policy. In 2020, the 5-year plan was very clear that it was going to be open source first. And in 2025, in talking about the period 26 to 30, China is clear that it is now directing the economy, the businesses, the public sector to focus on not being over diversified as it potentially is at the moment. So we don't have so many Chinese companies competing with each other, so many Chinese products competing with each other. And China is clearer about how it monetizes. We see them wanting to monetize the future of open source. So this is really going to be something to watch, and to watch if we see a streamline, a rationalization of competing open source technologies within China, and a clearer set of financial models to go with them. And this and many other things will be discussed on the 19th and 20th of February is the global leaders part of the summit. And the 16th and the 20th of February, we'll see the AI Impact Summit picking up on the action conversation in Paris, where we really started to see open source being part of the agenda. And one of the things we saw come out of Paris was a suite of tools being donated into a foundation called Roost. And if you look up Roost, what you'll see is this is a suite of software tools, not AI, but software tools to enable those who build AI. And we saw something similar in the UK about 18 months before that, where our AI Safety Institute released a platform called Inspect, which is a platform for certification for certification of AI LLMs. And it did that on an open basis, which enables a sort of form of self-certification, because the code being open, anyone can come in and do that testing. But additionally, it allows other AI safety institutes to build their base on top of it. So I think we will see two critical things in terms of AI. One being that the conversation on openness will just increase through 26 on the back of this summit. And another being we will see more and more de facto standards for governance coming out of tooling and AI, because the legislation is just too difficult to make and too complex. So that tooling piece, giving developers tools, giving devs tools that create a sort of AI ops, I think will be critical. We're also seeing open source projects complaining increasingly about being scraped. So we have these copyright challenges with text and data mining. And we also have projects becoming overwhelmed by open source contributions that are generated from AI. And there's some real problems around that I think will take some time to evolve, but it's part of the challenge of AI. And what I'm seeing more and more is that engineers are more and more comfortable with AI as a tool. It is a tool and nothing more, and that skills, experience, and discernment are required in good coding. And that isn't something yet we can rely on AI for. So there's not going to be an end to software developers anytime soon. Now, in conclusion, this is quite an old article I wrote about 4 years ago talking about open source as a public good. And I think it stands fast that the way the future of open source is going, whether we're talking about AI or open source software, it really needs to be treated as a digital public good. It's something that's increasingly becoming a de facto standard and something that we will see more and more adoption of. It is going to really be part of enabling the future. And I think we're seeing the world running to catch up with AI and open source software on an open basis. And I think it's something that we're going to see more and more work being done to ensure that it's funded in order that it's globally funded, collaboratively funded, so that the money is spent equitably, but also so that we see an open, transparent, and trusted future for our digital technologies. Didas. I've got one more. I'll just give you my contacts if anybody wants them.
All right. Can you hear me right?
I can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda Brook, for this session. So let us take, because time is going fast, let us take some questions around. Yeah, let me check it. We want, yes. Do you think that's okay? Let me put this question here.
Do I think that Africa, we're already at a stage where we can really think about AI on a large scale manner? I think everybody really is having this challenge, right? So everybody's using AI right now, thinking that it's something that it has to be built into enterprises. But actually, right now, it's a productivity tool and really not much more. And I think that for most people, the scale at which they're really practically using AI isn't as much as the rest of the world thinks they're using it at. I think we're a long way off there. And that was sort of the point I was driving to at the end with the engineers. It's very much using something like Copilot or another tool to assist and facilitate their processes to make their productivity better. But I don't think we're at a point where we can rely at all on AI.
Okay. Let us take some questions. Very good. He said, there is another one. He said, can Amanda give us
That doesn't seem like it finished. Africa, yeah. Western sovereign up on African models. Right. So what you're talking about, because the question is in two parts, and if you go to the next bit, the challenge we have in Africa. So I think this is super interesting, and it's definitely going to be something that's discussed a huge amount in February at the Impact Summit in Delhi. And what we're seeing is not just Africa, but everywhere in the world, having these LLMs that are coming out of two countries. They're coming out of China and the US. And what we see is that those are trained on data that's primarily from those countries. We're not seeing it being as globally trained. We're not seeing local language or culture. And I saw Jensen Huang talking at GPT in Paris back in June. And although he was selling chips effectively, he was talking really clearly and in a way that I think is helpful about culture and about a nation state's security. And what he was saying is that in each country, we need to be thinking about security, we need to be thinking about language, and we need to be thinking about culture and the underlying datas and norms that impact that in our AI. And really what we need is a localization of the existing LLMs. Now, for some people, the way they want to deal with that is through sovereignty. And when they say sovereignty, what they mean is building everything themselves. The problem is you are not going to be able to catch up with what's already out there easily unless you're using open source. And if you're using open source, you're using something that's been created globally or that's been built. So if we look at something like DeepSeek in China, it's been distilled from global LLMs. So what we then have to do is take the existing innovation and train it on our local data and make sure that it has that security that suits our country, but also that it has our local data and that it's in local languages. So if you look at the EU, they were talking about having 26 languages. India's got a whole raft of languages. Africa will have the same. And I think every nation state is having these same conversations. I've not had it particularly in Africa yet, but I know that being in India earlier this year, it was sort of super interesting to me that the conversation wasn't just about the same topics, but that we were at the same stage in knowing what the solutions were in India, as well as in the UK, the US, and Europe. So there's a lot still to be worked on there. And I think AI has a long way to go. So I think this is a great question about, for those who are still studying, what's the best way to use open source and AI to contribute effectively in your society? And I think we can split that into two. So from a personal usage perspective, you're using AI as a tool. You're using open source to develop your skills. And by developing those skills, you will start at the most basic level, right? You're going to be, if you participate in a project, you're going to be at the most basic level where you might be fixing a typo in a document as your first contribution. And gradually you will understand how that particular project works. You'll get familiar with the leadership in it. You'll get familiar with the way you can contribute and help. And over time, you will start, and it is over time, making code contributions, which will probably initially be rejected, and somebody will hopefully kindly explain to you why and help you build your contribution. But what you will learn is skills by contributing to that project that are skills that will apply in the workplace. So it gives you an advantage or a benefit that you're not just being taught in an academic way, you're being taught in a practical way, the way that you would be in a job. And what that will do for you is make it much more accessible make you much more accessible to the job market, because your contributions in GitHub or whichever repo you're on are going to be a living CV. And any company that uses the project that you are contributing to, as you become somebody recognized within that project, is going to be interested in hiring you. There was a really good blog post about 2 years ago, I think February 24, from Mark Zuckerberg, talking about how Meta recruits, and that when it comes to software engineers, they don't do open recruiting the way they used to. They go and look at the projects that they as a company are using and look at who's contributing. And they will then follow those people through. And you even see that in AI in the way that they have been hiring people around Llama and picking them up from other open projects they've been contributing to. So what's next? So how can the community oversee ethical use of AI and open source? This is quite a difficult one, because one of the great things about open source is that we don't judge. Anyone can use the code for any purpose, and the job of making ethical decisions sits with governments and lawmakers. In open source, we're not about making those ethical decisions, because those would be restrictions, and those are something that sit away from us. So I don't feel that it's really our responsibility to make ethical decisions. And I think it's right that it doesn't sit with a group of individuals, but it sits with those who have been elected into those positions. However, I think there is a piece around the fact that making it open and using good practices, which will come from things like the Rust tooling, to meet basic standards so that other people taking it know that they've got something on those standards. I think that open source tooling is going to be really critical in it. The whole piece around AI regulation is quite complex, because where we've seen regulation happen, it hasn't really worked. So the EU created an AI Act that is about 2 inches thick if you print it out. And it's so prescriptive and so dense that nobody can really comply with it. So although they've brought it into force, they're not going to enforce it. They're not going to make people comply with it for at least a year. And it's already out of date, because AI is moving so fast, it's hard to keep up with it. And I think what we really have to accept is that we should be building the best we can and using the tooling that's available to us to bring it to the standards that we can do without it being too difficult.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much. I think the time is finished. So for those who have questions, you can ask Amanda. You can follow Amanda on LinkedIn, so on Twitter. So then you can ask a question. Because we don't have enough time, so thank you so much for everyone who came to watch this live. And so you can follow me on LinkedIn also, Didas Mbaoshimana, and you can follow Amanda also. If you have some question, I said you can ask her. Thank you so much, Amanda, for this session, and yeah, see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.